Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk about World War I and the technologies used in World War I, which are amazingly and terribly frightening. As I mentioned in a previous video, I talked about how the 19th century is indeed the mother of invention, the mother of innovation and technology. But the 20th century is right on its tail, because the 20th century was a century in which many of the ideas of the 19th century were eventually developed and brought to fruition. And World War I was perhaps the most lethal, frightening war ever fought. Because what happened was it became a war of technology. And we used every one of the skills, every one of the innovations, every one of the inventions, and found new and inventive ways to kill each other. It's a very frightening war. And I'd like to talk about some of that innovation. First off, heavier-than-air flight had been developed. And, well, the first flight was the Wright brothers, more or less in December of 1903. By 1914, in which the year in which World War I started, the aeroplane, as it was called in those days, definitely had not improved that drastically. It had improved quite a bit, but it was still very much like a flying kite with a propeller on it. And it required a great deal of skill to keep that thing in the air. A great deal of technology would be developed during World War I. It was my pleasure many, many years ago to interview an aviator from World War I. His name was Enos Nagel. He gave me 2 photographs, which I need to pull out one of these days, of him in his training plane, which was a Curtiss Jenny, back in 1917. Now, the thing that I learned about aviation, of course, that there was a lot of problems. When World War I started in 1914, which was due to the, well, actually, Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated, and his wife, Sophie. But the fact is that that was hardly a reason for a war to start. It was an excuse for a war to start. You see, World War I, there really wasn't a bad guy in World War I in all the major countries fighting. Everybody had an alliance with everyone else, and due to a very senile old king, he basically started a war. And this caused all of the other countries, like dominoes, to go to war and fight with each other. In many respects, many of the leaders of these countries were all related. Got to remember, Kaiser Wilhelm was the favorite grandson of Queen Victoria. And the Tsar of Russia was the cousin of the King of England, and so on and so forth. And so the war started, and of course, everyone would get into the air. Now, the Germans would get into the air, the Allies would get into the air. And of course, just being in the air was a vast majority of the work. And of course, they used it for scouting and for surveillance and stuff. And they would pass by each other, and they would wave at each other. That's all they could do. And then somebody got the idea to bring a pistol up in the air. And they did. And they tried shooting at the other individual. And of course, once that started, both sides would bring guns up with them and try shooting at each other, which was really, if you think about it, highly ineffective. Because, you know, 2 planes that are doing probably about 60 miles an hour each, the combined speed would be like 120. It's pretty hard to shoot at a target moving that fast. There were some casualties, but very, very few. And the most nasty thing is they made faces at each other. Seriously. And then they got the bright idea to put the gun in the front of the plane so they could direct it at the other. Well, this proved quite difficult because they immediately started the idea of putting a machine gun in the front. They just plopped it there and they would shoot, but they shut off their propellers. That did not work until they discovered the best way to do it is to have the machine gun as part of the engine, and therefore it would fire in between the movement of the propeller. Once that happens, they become lethal machines. And a number of casualties, of course, would be incurred. Half of the problems would be due to mechanical failure. But once they found good ways of destroying each other, it became pretty lethal. Other things that were done, if you think about it, first off, the machine gun is used, and perhaps one of the most horrid parts of World War I was the use of gas. Now, they used all kinds of nerve gases, mustard gases, and they were pretty horrific. And so many people were scarred for life from that. They had conventions, Geneva conventions after that, saying that they won't use gas in warfare. Now, I find this a little fascinating. It's sort of like having a referee in a game, isn't it? When you think about it, we won't do this in this game. It's war. War, in many respects, has no rules. But they decided to use some civility. You also have to remember it was trench warfare, basically by late 1914 all the way up to late 1918. It was just trench warfare. Now, of course, they used the wireless. They used Marconi devices to send telegraph messages. But the problem was it was not possible to do in the field of battle. So they had runners. I interviewed a runner from World War I. His name was Chris Pettier, many, many years ago in the 1970s. And he showed me his helmet. And the side of the helmet had lightning bolts going down the side. And what that was about was the fact, he said, we had to run faster than lightning. And he said usually they gave the message to 2 or 3 runners. And they would have to run in between the trenches. Well, they knew one of them would make it at least. Chris Pettier made it through the war as a runner. An extremely dangerous and extremely difficult branch of that service. It's interesting to note, on the German side, Adolf Hitler was a runner going between the trenches and was wounded twice. Received the Iron Cross twice. I know Chris Pettier won many medals for his wonderful service. And I remember talking to him, and he was in his 80s when I was talking to him. And he used to tell me, he said, it scared the hell out of me, he said. And he said, I did it. And he said, I never, ever want to see a trench again. Now, getting back to other technologies, think about submarines. The submarine is also an improvement of ideas from the 19th century. And you think about it, the submarine became a highly effective weapon, mostly for the Germans. Now you have to remember that the British were doing blockades to starve Germany. And so the Germans came up with their U-boat warfare and sank a great deal of the British shipping. In fact, the way they did it was very civil in the beginning of World War I. The submarine would rise out of the water and hail the ship. They would fire across the bow and saying, we are going to sink your ship, but please evacuate everyone from the ship, and once you're all off, we will sink the ship. That was very civilized. Well, the British said when the Germans do that, ram the submarine, which changed the very tenor of the war, because at that point, the Germans stopped surfacing and just would fire at will. And of course, perhaps one of the greatest markings of total war would be the RMS Lusitania. The Lusitania was much more than it was made out to be. Of course, we called it an unarmed merchant vessel filled with passengers. What we didn't talk about was the fact that she was carrying arms. She was carrying munitions. She was carrying bullets. She was carrying gun cotton. She was carrying all kinds of munitions, including about 10 tons of cheese. Now think about this. When does cheese go from America to Europe? Cheese always goes west. Nobody in Europe wants American cheese, and Americans want European cheeses. Well, nonetheless, she was carrying about 10 tons of cheese. She was a highly subdivided ship. She was designed to work as a light cruiser, set to Admiralty standards. That was the deal when she was made. And yet she sank in 18 minutes. Something went radically wrong. Basically, my thought is that the cheese exploded. I think that's what happened. But the submarine warfare was highly effective and very damning for the Germans, because there was a great deal of propaganda. Once again, a whole new field of warfare was propaganda, and that was used highly effectively by the English against the Germans. Also, communications. The English cut the one line that was going through Germany, and they knew everything that was going on. And they took that advantage by hearing what the Germans were doing, and then they would slightly change it to make the Germans look worse. Half of the atrocities that the British said the Germans did were never done. It was just pure fabrication. So you have gas, you have aviation, you had Zeppelins, which was also another form of warfare. And if you think about it, the Zeppelin was highly effective during World War I, at least in the earliest days of World War I, because they could fly higher than the planes. And they could basically go out unopposed and drop their bombs, and they were very effective until they developed ways for the planes to go higher and also learn to use incendiary bullets. And the incendiary bullets, of course, would hit the Zeppelin, which was filled with hydrogen, and they were gone. And so, of course, the Zeppelin lost its effectiveness, except in certain fields of battle. One being nighttime, secondly, in stormy weather, cloudy weather, where it was hard to see. And they were highly effective. We had ideas, we had the Naval Review Board in Washington, D.C., which was chaired and headed by Thomas Edison, who was a 19th century man, and a 19th century man who was trying to come up with 20th century ideas. It didn't work. And it was kind of embarrassing, the ideas he came up with. I wanted to mention one of them to you. There were 40 of them. And it was basically a design for a squirt gun on an airplane to shoot ink, an inky substance, onto the goggles of the other aviator. Now, I realize how foolish this sounds, but you have to understand at the time, Edison thought it was a doggone good idea. And, well, he didn't quite... This is a man who never flew, by the way. Edison was never in a plane, so he had no real understanding of it. And when he devised this, he made the suggestion that an aviator could go and shoot a squirt gun at the other plane and blind the other guy by getting ink all over his goggles, and he wouldn't be able to see. Well, let's just put it that way, that's not going to work, okay? They actually tried doing it in a parking lot with 2 planes sitting stationary, and they had a hard time doing it. There were lots of other things he came up with, and he was very angry because he said, I came up with a whole 40 inventions and they pigeonholed every damn one of them. Well, there's a reason for it. They were not very good. Other aspects, think about the machine guns, the weaponry, the rockets, the gas, the submarines, the various and inventive ways to kill each other. You have to remember, we never quite got over World War I, and we're still fighting World War I. We don't realize that. Because what we did at the end of World War I was come up with the Treaty of Versailles, which just guaranteed that there was going to be a whole mess of wars in the future. It's an amazing thing when you think of all that technology. When you think of all the things that were done in World War I, all of the weaponry, all of the various ways that we found to kill each other. And truly, the world has never quite been the same because the savage nature of man was truly released through the technology of World War I. A war to end all wars was what they said. But in reality, it was a war that guaranteed many, many more. Thank you.